Okay, what I'm going to do, I'm going to solve this quadratic equation using completing the square. So when you do an quadratic equation using completing the square, the first thing is you cannot have a leading coefficient on the x squared. So the fact that you have 9 here, I'm going to have to divide the whole thing by 9 first. So that's what I'm going to do first. Okay, so I'm going to divide each term by 9. Now let's simplify those fractions that we'll have there. Okay, so now dividing through by the 9, that leaves the x squared minus 12 over 9 reduces to 4 over 3, and then 9 over 9 is 1, and then that equals 0. So the next thing I need to do in using completing the square is I need to move the constant to the right side. So we're going to move the 1 over. So let me do that step. Okay, so I move the plus 1 over as a minus 1. So next we have to do the completing the square step. So if you'll remember, you take the middle term and you take half of that middle term and then you square that middle term. So we're going to work with the fraction 4/3. So I'm going to come over to the side here and we're going to think about that in that way. So let me pause the video for just a second. Okay, so I've got the middle term, which was negative 4/3, and I'm going to take half of it. So I'm going to multiply that times 1/2. When you multiply fractions, you can either cross cancel or you can multiply straight across on top and bottom and reduce. I'm going to cancel the 2 and 4 and then reduce my fraction that way. So I'm going to pause it one more second. Okay, so negative 4/3 times 1/2, that reduces down to negative 2/3. So we had to half it, we did that step. Now we've got to square that quantity. So I'm going to raise that quantity to the second power. Okay, so when I square the quantity, negative 2/3, then you have to square the numerator and the denominator. So that would give me 2 negatives will make a positive. So let's see here, you got negative 2 squared will give me positive 4, and then on bottom 3 squared will give me 9. So the quantity we're going to add to both sides, that's going to complete the square, is 4/9. So I'm going to add 4/9 to both sides of my equation. All right, so the number we came up with was 4/9, and I've added it now to both sides of the equation. Remember, whatever you add to one side of the equation, you have to add to the other side of the equation. So added 4/9 on both sides. What has happened now on the left side is we should be able to factor that into a perfect square. Now on the right side of the equal sign, you're just going to have to add fractions to combine those. So let's take a second and look at that. All right, looking at the left side of the equal sign, since we have x squared is a perfect square on the left side, and on the right side 4/9 is also a perfect square, we know that that's going to factor in the quantity x, which is the square root of x squared, the sign of the middle term, which is a negative, so it's going to be minus, and then the square root of the constant 4/9. The square root of 4 is 2, the square root of 9 is 3, so 2/3. The left side will factor as x minus 2/3 squared. So I also now need to combine the fractions on the right side of the equation. Let's take a second and go over how to add fractions. You can also use a calculator for this step. Okay, on the right side of that expression, you had negative 1 plus 4/9. So I'm going to change the negative 1 so it'll have a common denominator. We're going to change that to negative 9 over 9, and then plus 4/9. So since they have the same denominator now, 9ths, we can just add the numerators together. Negative 9 plus 4, which would give me negative 5. Now in this case, like I said, you could use your calculator to do that computation. You should be able to just type in minus 1 plus 4/9 on your calculator and get this expression that you see here. Now, if we take that back to the problem, we now have the perfect square on the left side, x minus 2/3 quantity squared, equal to negative 5 over 9. So to finish this out, solving the quadratic equation, we need to use the square roots property. That means I'm going to take the square root of both sides of the equation. So let's see what will happen when I do that. Okay, using the square roots property, if I take the square root of both sides, the square root of x minus 2/3 quantity squared is going to be equal to plus or minus, remember we have to do the positive and negative to get the two solutions we need, the square root of negative 5/9. So taking the square root, what happens is when you take the square root of something squared, the squared part just goes away. So you just have x minus 2/3. equal to, plus or minus. When you take the square root of a fraction, you have to take the square root of the numerator over the square root of the denominator. Now, the square root of -5 we'll just leave alone for a second, and then the square root of 9 we know is 3, so that comes out from under the radical. No square root of 9. It's just going to be 3 on the bottom there. Okay, so x minus 2/3 equals plus or minus, and remember, if we have a negative number under the radical, we can factor an I for an imaginary unit. We can factor that out of the radical. So you have I squared root of 5 over 3. So the last step to finish solving here is to get the x by itself. So what I want to do is add that 2/3 over to the right side. So let's take a second to do that. All right, so when I add the 2/3 over to the right side, I have 2/3 plus or minus I square root of 5 over 3. So we have a common denominator there. Now, I'm going to break this up into your two different answers. I think in MyLabs Plus, this is how they require you to write your answers. So we've got 2/3 plus the square root of 5 over 3i. That's in your complex number form. And then you have 2/3 minus the square root of 5 over 3i. So you have two unreal answers or solutions to that equation. I hope this helps.